Good morning and welcome to Sharper Iron. Spend the next hour with us studying the living and active Word of God, His two-edged sword of law and gospel, recorded for you in Holy Scripture, all about Jesus Christ, crucified, risen, and ascended for you. Thanks for tuning in this morning here on KFUO, Christ for you, anytime, anywhere. I am your host, Pastor Timothy Appel of Faith Lutheran Church in Godfrey, Illinois. Sharper Iron is underwritten by Lutheran Church Extension Fund. Together in Faith, LCEF helps to start, sustain, and strengthen LCMS ministries through financial and strategic partnerships. Visit lcef.org for more information. On this Tuesday, February 24th, we are studying Genesis chapter 21, verses 22 to 34. In today's text, Abraham promises not to deal falsely with Abimelech, and the two men make a covenant at Beersheba. To help us sharpen our faith in Christ as we study God's Word today, we have with us regular guest, Pastor Rick Jones. Pastor Jones serves as chaplain and vice president of spiritual life at the Dakota Boys and Girls Ranch in Minot, North Dakota. Pastor Jones, welcome back to Sharper Iron.
Yeah, excellent. Thanks for having me. Always enjoy being here.
As we get started today, Pastor, talk to us about the context in which we find ourselves looking at the end of Genesis 21.
Right. So here we've got our first patriarch, Abraham, within his sojourning stage of life, I guess, having another interaction with Abimelech. This is the same Abimelech that he had met a chapter earlier as he and Sarah are traveling and, tells Sarah to say she's his sister and not his wife. And so we've seen Abimelech before. Now we're going to get a new sort of chapter in their relationship. So we got a couple people here. Obviously, we already talked about Abraham, our founding patriarch, the man whose name means father of a nation or father of a people, connected to the covenant, God's guy to go do what he's going to do for his people. Abimelech is called the king of Gerar, which is basically the Negeb, which is that desert region between what is at this time sort of the Canaanite area and Egypt south. He brings with him a man named Appel, who doesn't seem to fit anywhere else in the narrative. Different type of name, different ethnicity. Both Abraham and Abimelech have the root for father in their names. Abimelech means basically my father is king. It's a Semitic name, just like Abraham. Appel, it's more like an Aegean name, or maybe like Asia Minor. And so that, I think, is going to get some flavor into why we talk about the Philistines in this text, but we don't know for sure, but I think it's logical. But yeah, we don't know who this guy is other than he's introduced as the commander of Abimelech's army. His name means strong or mouth for all, which I think is probably why he's there. He's going to be the one that speaks on behalf of the covenant, the witness. But yeah, it happens early in the patristic period, this encounter, perhaps mid-21st century, around sometime between 2060 and 2040 BC, maybe the mid-2050s, right in there. It's within the childhood of Isaac, after the exile of Hagar and Ishmael, but before that sacrifice trial on Mount Moriah. Again, same Abimelech who Abraham and Sarah had dealings with earlier, and this now is going to be a treaty, a covenant that takes place basically over ownership of a well and for continued diplomatic relations. It happens at Beersheba, or what will become Beersheba at the end of this text, which is at this time probably a watering hole or a little rest outpost. It's about 50 miles southwest of Jerusalem. It would eventually be the southern border for Jerusalem, or for Israel.
Yeah, and just as we're introducing things here, I think that's one of the reasons that this text is here and is important, is because Beersheba does become an important geographic marker for the land of Israel. A pretty standard way of referring to the promised land is from Dan, which is the north, to Beersheba, the south. And so this has been happening all along in the book of Genesis, where significant places, certainly in the history of Israel ongoing, get introduced here, and sometimes with anachronisms. You've got the mention of the Philistines, which I'm sure we'll talk about more. Right, all of these players are being introduced here in the book of Genesis, and at the time you might be wondering, I wonder why that's there. If you're just reading straight through it like we are here in Sharper Iron. But when you know the whole story, and you're one of the Israelites that Moses is reading or writing this for right at 500 years into the future.
Right.
Well, then it's like, oh, that's why they know where this is, and
Yep.
they need to know this. So do we. But that's,
Yep.
I think, one of the reasons this text is here.
Yep, absolutely. And that's why we see those, as you said, is it an anachronism? Well, it's written at a later time. So it's a reference, that timestamp for people. Yeah, it's written for people to be able to understand. And so as we see that fuller narrative, all that will fall into place.
Good. So let's go ahead and read the text. There's going to be more of that introductory material to talk about, but it's helpful to know what's here first. So this is,
Right.
again, Genesis 21, starting at verse 22. At that time, Abimelech and Phicol, the commander of his army, said to Abraham, God is with you in all that you do. Now, therefore, swear to me here by God that you will not deal falsely with me, or with my descendants, or with my posterity. But as I have dealt kindly with you, so you will deal with me and with the land where you have sojourned. And Abraham said, I will swear. When Abraham reproved Abimelech about the well of water that Abimelech's servants had seized, Abimelech said, I do not know who has done this thing. You did not tell me, and I have not heard of it until today. So Abraham took sheep and oxen and gave them to Abimelech, and the two men made a covenant. Abraham set 7 ewe lambs of the flock apart. And Abimelech said to Abraham, What is the meaning of these 7 ewe lambs that you have set apart? He said, These 7 ewe lambs you will take from my hand, that this may be a witness for me that I dug this well. Therefore that place was called Beersheba, because there both of them swore an oath. So they made a covenant at Beersheba. Then Abimelech and Phicol, the commander of his army, rose up and returned to the land of the Philistines. Abraham planted a tamarisk tree in Beersheba and called there on the name of the Lord, the everlasting God. And Abraham sojourned many days in the land of the Philistines. That's the text for today, Genesis 21, verses 22 to 34. So, Pastor Jones, kind of with those introductory remarks again, this text begins at that time that you noted we met Abimelech a chapter ago in chapter 20. But since then, some pretty significant stuff has happened, namely the birth of Isaac in chapter 21. That's kind of been the whole point of Abraham's story. And now here we're back talking about Abimelech. So, I mean, chronology-wise, are we out of order here? And why? Some of those, we know the scriptures are not always recorded for us in order, but sometimes thematically. So, I mean, what do you make of some of those issues that might come up?
Right. As you're kind of alluding to, there's a lot of discussion amongst commentators on why is this where it is? Why isn't it right there after the previous encounter with Abimelech? Even that phrasing at that time, it fits better with there, or at least from our maybe understanding, our perspective, we think it would fit better there grammatically and things. Yeah, I don't know. I don't think it matters necessarily precisely where these events happen in the timeline of Abraham's life. But I do think that question points to some interesting differences between ancient and modern day history and the way we keep records. So in the ancient time, they don't have the technology to have exact carbon copies or electronic copies or anything like that. And so the ancient world would focus more on the significance, not the intricacies of those sorts of things. It is about seeing the importance of what is happening, not charting the exact date and time. And so what do we see? How are these things connected? Well, we see that these encounters with Abimelech and then that drama between Sarah and Hagar and with Isaac and Ishmael, it all happened at roughly the same period within the span of Abraham's life. And so perhaps it's similar lessons that we need to learn from these grouped accounts. Specifically, I think it gets to that part of the covenant where God says, through Abraham, all nations will be blessed. So Abimelech now is going to have a positive diplomatic relationship with Abraham and the peoples that come from him. And we know that God is going to turn Ishmael into a whole nation in himself. It's going to be another people group that's going to now be blessed on earth. So the whole world is going to be blessed through the promises of Yahweh. I think that's the more important reason as to why this is placed here. And yes, it does happen in this time of his life. We just don't have to worry about those specific things,
Sure. Yeah, and I mean, as you read through this text of Genesis, this is one of those places where I can understand why people would be scratching their heads as to, well, we just met Abimelech, and he didn't seem like that important of a character.
Right.
Why does he come up again here? And that makes you wonder if maybe the stories are out of order chronologically. I don't think it's a huge deal to think that they are in order chronologically either.
No,
I
not
mean,
at all.
we know Abraham's moving around, and
Correct.
Abimelech's a pretty important guy, especially since we meet a commander of his army at this text.
Yeah.
So it wouldn't surprise me at all if Abraham interacts with him in a number of different situations in his life, especially after the birth of Isaac.
Yep.
But I think the point that you made, either way, wherever it happens chronologically, exactly, seeing it here, particularly after the birth of Isaac, I think is very significant, because we've been told all along that Abraham is going to be a blessing to all the families of the earth and through his offspring. And so now that the offspring is here, to see God do that, I think is a significant thing as we consider the faithfulness of God. And I also think in that regard, it maybe helps us, if we were wondering a little bit after Hagar and Ishmael got sent away in the previous text, like, well, what does that mean for the relationship of Abraham and his family to other nations? Here we see a friendly relationship.
Yes.
And again, all those things, I think, regardless of the chronology, in terms of where the placement is, that helps, I think.
I agree completely. Yeah, it's showing, again, that piece that God is serious about keeping his promise. And we're seeing those pieces be put together. We're seeing the seeds be planted for what will happen generations down the road.
Yeah. Another thing, just before we talk about Abimelech and Phicol and what they come to Abraham saying, just the fact that you see Abraham acting in this way and being treated in the way that he is a reminder of how important Abraham actually is in the land of Canaan. It's very easy, especially since, I suppose, chapter 14, to only think about Abraham, Sarah, and maybe one or two other people around them, here and there. But the fact that you have a king of a nation coming with his army commander to make a treaty with Abraham is a reminder that Abraham is a pretty formidable guy. And I mean, just from an earthly perspective, apart from all the divine promises, which is what's on the mind of these two men, but just from an earthly perspective, he's a pretty formidable guy who's traveling around this land of Canaan. You want him to be on your side, which and that maybe that's a good lead into the theological aspect. So talk about what Abimelech and Phicol come saying to Abraham at the beginning of this text.
Right. Well, they have a very good observation of Abraham's life, right? Things tend to keep going well for him. They're saying, well, perhaps it's divine will or miraculous things are happening for Abraham, so we need to handle him the right way. But then even in that previous encounter with Abimelech, we learn that God spoke to Abimelech in a dream concerning Abraham having God's favor. And that then led to a positive outcome in that situation, right, for Abraham and Sarah in the whole, you should lie about who you are situation. That was just weird. And then that his son is going to repeat that is bizarre with another man named Abimelech, by the way. So there you go. But just they see God working in Abraham's life, and they want to make sure they're on the right side of God's favor. They need to do the right thing. They see the prosperity, they see the blessing, and they want to make sure they're on his good side. He brings Phicol with him as a witness, I would say, first and foremost, to what is hopefully going to be a positive political negotiation. And again, I think this is where Phicol's name comes in, voice for all. His role is going to be the eyewitness. He's going to make sure that the testimony lines up with everything that happens. He's the witness for the covenant. He's going to pledge to its legitimacy, so to speak. Some do make a lot out of Phicol's presence there. They suggest that this is completely out of worldly self-preservation and maybe even only at the suggestion and prodding of his advisors that Abimelech is here. Like Phicol was insistent, you need to go make this treaty. This is the only thing that's right. But I don't know that we need to go that far. I think it's a little presumptuous. We aren't given Abimelech's motives in the text. And so it's okay to say he wanted to have an official witness, like a notary republic, so to speak, to testify to these things. He wanted that witness. But they want to set up good relations. He sees that divine fortune and care in Abraham's life and wants to be an honorable ally. And so he sets out to make a formal agreement, a covenant. And he brings along this witness to ensure everything is handled in the right way and with proper order.
Yeah, I think you see, well, Abimelech and Phicol, wherever this happens chronologically, I guess there's maybe two things they've perhaps observed recently. If it's out of order chronologically, then the fact that Abraham's intercession, for the household of Abimelech brought about the blessing that the Lord had told them, then that makes sense that they're like, oh, hey, we need to capitalize on this. The other thing that's possible is if we are in chronological order, they're looking at Abraham walking around here in the land of Canaan. He's 100 years old and he just had a kid,
Right.
I mean, like, that's not a small thing that I think, obviously we've been thinking about it for a while here in Genesis, but sometimes it's easy to forget because we're so used to the story. So either way, again, Abimelech and Phicol are paying attention to what's going on here. They want a good relationship with Abraham, certainly politically, but we're talking about, especially theologically, is where that needs to be, and that's where we're seeing the faithfulness of God. So they ask for an oath, and this is an important thing, especially when we get to the name Beersheba. We'll talk more about that, but the fact that we've got an oath here early on sets the stage for all that. So talk about the oath that they asked for.
Right. So, Abimelech says, swear you will not deal falsely with me, with my offspring and my prosperity. And he sets out this, I've dealt kindly with you. Let's make sure this is all in good order. I think it's interesting, that phrase, that offspring and prosperity in the Hebrew, it's alliterated. The closest thing I can come up with, and that I saw anybody come up with in English, would be kith and kin. Other than that, we can't really get an ongoing sort of translation. But so he puts this little spin on it to make it diplomatic sounding, I think, too, right? He's just in the flowery language. But yeah, he's the one that sets up the terms. Abimelech sets up the terms and presents Abraham with what he wants. He begins by acknowledging Abraham's special place with God, and then he reminds Abraham of his integrity in their previous dealings. He's looking for assurance that his reign and his legacy will be honored by Abraham and his descendants, those that will be his representatives. And Abimelech actually uses, one of those really good Old Testament words. He uses hesed. It gets translated as kindly here, but usually it's translated as something like steadfast love or sometimes mercy. And it is a trait he most often used to describe God in his attitude towards his people. In the New Testament, we might compare it to the love agape, right? That divine sacrificial love that is only possible in Christ. And it might be, this is a little bit of an aside, but we've got a couple of pairs of Hebrew and Greek words like that get into God's nature. So in Greek, we have the word logos. It means word, and we use it for the word of God that stands behind everything, that divine essence that is the foundation of all things, and even Christ himself, right, is the Logos made flesh. Well, in the Old Testament, that same idea for God's law, for his divine will, would be Torah. It's not just law in the sense of those rules, but rather, again, it is that divine will of God that stands behind all things. So, in that sense, Torah is to Logos as Chesed is to agape. This isn't really specific to this text, but rather it's pointing us again to those bigger connections and those teachings that span the entirety of Scripture, and it helps us see the through line, not just in God's overarching plan for salvation, but also how these are touch points for his people, for humanity throughout history. God is working and showing himself with his word and his love. And Abimelech has had a taste of that, and he's seen that in Abraham. And he's perhaps now seeking to hold on to that same sort of tangential blessing through this diplomacy with Abraham. But in any event, Abraham agrees to this covenant. He says, that sounds all good and right. And he promises to honor the covenant. I swear, right? I will swear.
Yeah, one thing that stands out in the terms that Abimelech puts forward, Just the reality that he wants Abraham to deal well with his descendants and posterity
Yeah.
is a significant thing. And again, wherever you put it chronologically, it's probably even more remarkable if we're out of order chronologically and Isaac hasn't been born at this point, that
Yeah.
Abraham or that Abimelech is concerned about Abraham treating his posterity well when Abraham doesn't have a child. But even if he's only got just the one child, Isaac, and he's only just been weaned, like
Yeah.
and that I think is a significant thing that Abimelech sees the need to create a treaty with this guy who's only got one kid at most, who's not very, very old. Again, shows what's in terms of the theological impact that it has upon us. We are seeing the certainty of God's promise here, that
Right.
even when Abraham and Sarah only have one son who's not very old, there's a foreign king who knows he needs to make a treaty, is a reminder to us as readers, this promise that God has made is going to happen.
Right. Right. So yes, I absolutely tied into the miraculous birth of Isaac in the old age and things like that. I think we also sometimes forget Abraham's got like a whole community with him. He's got that whole caravan. It wasn't just him and Sarai that left from Ur. It was everybody with them, and he's got Lot with him for a while and all of that. And this is a whole community that's traveling and doing all this. And so they got to definitely see that things are happening, and things happen for Abraham, and you need to be connected to that.
Absolutely, absolutely. What about one thing that I notice in the text is that Abimelech has this long, speech here about why he wants to make this treaty, and then Abraham's just like, "I will swear."
Yeah.
I don't know if there's. It just strikes me that Abraham's speech is much. He's not as flowery as Abimelech is at this point. I don't know if there's anything to say other than just to notice that.
Maybe he does know. Maybe this is sort of he knows it's about keeping face, and it's about these definitive. He's just like, okay, yeah, I don't know. It could just be maybe that's the formal way you're supposed to respond. I don't know. We don't know these things, but
yeah, that could be. This could just be a matter of formality. There's certainly places like that in the scriptures where you see the very formal or cultural way of speaking back and forth that may seem strange to us. But Abraham agrees. So some sort of treaty is set or in the works at this point. Again, this is another one of those places between verse 24 and 25 where I think sometimes there's some question. Is this happening again in order? Or is this going back to recount what led to something like this? But this does relate, to be sure. It comes now. The treaty is either put to the test or it's related to this conversation about a well. We got probably about 3 or 4 minutes here before the break.
Yeah.
Let's start talking about what happens with the well. Maybe we should start by talking about the importance of a well.
Sure. So wells would be extremely important in this part of the world. The Negev is an arid desert climate. I actually looked it up. This part of the world gets less than 8 inches of rainfall each year. And so with Abraham sojourning through this time in his life, it was likely he migrated his flocks north to the hill country of Judah in the winter months while staying near this area, now known as Beersheba, during the winter months. It would have been the favorable seasons in each. So a well was a source of refuge and life and livelihood for a guy who is a nomadic herdsman. This would have been essential to make sure that he's able to continue to provide for his community by taking care of his flocks, taking care of his family. Even if it's not a big established, city at this time, it is still a very important place because water is the substance of life.
And it's remarkable how many times, just outside of all of that, how many times a well is a location for a key biblical happening. We've seen. Maybe just think about wells happening. What comes to mind?
Oh, I always think of the woman at the well with Jesus. Why is she there in the middle of the day? And you get all of that, but it happens at the well. Regardless of what's going on in your life, you still need water, and so you have to find a way to get to it. We think of where some of the other patriarchs are going to get their wives happen at wells. Yeah, there's all sorts of things where wells come into play.
Yep. Yeah. So, and this is a very important one. As we've noted, Beersheba becomes a significant landmark in the promised land. And we will see more about what happens here at Beersheba between Abraham and Abimelech on the other side of the break. You're listening to Sharper Iron on KFUO. We are talking to Pastor Rick Jones this morning about Genesis 21. We'll be right back. Please stick around.
Did you know that an investment with Lutheran Church Extension Fund exclusively supports LCMS ministries and church workers? That's right. LCEF ensures LCMS churches, schools, and organizations have access to the financial resources they need to sustain, strengthen, and start ministry work. In other words, you can feel good investing with LCEF because we share your Lutheran values and love for the church. Learn more at lcef.org. LCF is a nonprofit religious organization. Therefore, LCF investments are not FDIC insured bank deposit accounts. This is not an offer to sell investments or solicitation to buy. LCF will offer and sell its securities only in states where authorized. The offer is made solely by LCF's offering circular. Investors should carefully read the offering circular, which more fully describes associated risks.
Welcome back to Sharper Iron. It is Tuesday, February 24th. We are studying Genesis chapter 21, verses 22 to 34 with Pastor Rick Jones. He serves as chaplain and vice president of spiritual life at the Dakota Boys and Girls Ranch in Minot, North Dakota. Pastor Jones, prior to the break, we were talking about the importance of wells in the Old Testament, and just for the people in this part of the world, still access to water is so important to all people around the world, everywhere, whether you get it from a well or another source. Yeah. Here we are at the well that ends up being named Beersheba, as we will see. So at this well, Abraham complains to Abimelech that some of the servants have taken it, and Abimelech says, I don't know, I claim innocence. What's going on? Talk about the conflict here at Beersheba.
Right. So I think it's interesting that they start with Abimelech lays out that whole, as you said, long, speech leading into the covenant. Abraham says, yeah, I swear. But then he says, oh, but by the way, I've got this well that I dug and some of your people have taken it. I'd like to get that sorted out. And yeah, Abimelech kind of says, oh, I've never heard of this before. So yeah, they enter into the covenant relationship. Abraham brings up that point of integrity, right? If Abimelech is trying to point to how kindly he has dealt with Abraham, he needs to bring this up. He needs to air it all out. It had been seized again by Abimelech's subjects. If they're going to truly uphold a covenant with one another, all things need to be out in the open. And so he brings up this well. It could be Abraham testing Abimelech's intentions for or it could be establishing Abraham's side of the terms of the contract. It doesn't really matter which one of those things it is. It could be both. But he brings it up because wells are of essential importance. And Abraham wants to see how Abimelech is going to handle this potential dispute. But Abimelech seems to genuinely not know about the situation, and he absolutely vouches for Abraham's claim to the well. That's the picture that's painted there. And so they enter into that contract. Abraham is satisfied with Abimelech's response, and he honors the covenant. And then he has sort of the customary gift that goes along with making these sorts of contracts and treaties, right? He brings in the livestock. It's a good faith payment by Abraham to show he will keep his end of the covenant. And then we get those 7 ewes are kind of, they're set apart in the text, and he literally sets them apart. Right? The lambs, these are sort of a special notarization on his claim to the well. This gesture also demonstrates Abraham's goodwill and generosity towards Abimelech. And maybe, again, could be through Abraham's direct action now, a representation of that covenant promise that all nations will be blessed through God's promise.
Before we talk about the animals, especially the fact that there's 7, let's just kind of we kind of skipped over this in the first part of the text. some of the similarities and differences between this interaction and the previous interaction in chapter 20. Abimelech starts by saying, I want you to swear to me that you're not going to deal falsely with me.
Right.
And I think, right, so
there you go. Yeah.
you come up with the previous one. And I mean, so I think there's he's maybe Abimelech, as much as he wants to be associated with Abraham, he knows he needs to be. He also has recognized, well, Abraham hasn't been entirely forthright with me before.
Right.
I need to make sure that's the case now. And then this protest of innocence on Abimelech's part strikes me as very similar to the way that he spoke to God in the previous. I don't know, just talk a little bit about some of those similarities, but also any differences that you see as well.
Right. No, I didn't even think about that. That's a wonderful contrast and connection here. Yeah. Abimelech starts that by saying, don't deal false with me, sort of because you did before. You lied to me before, or you were not completely honest with me before. And so maybe even Abimelech is feeling out Abraham here. Has he learned his lesson? Was that legitimately out of fear the first time? And now that we've had this interaction, we can continue in this positive direction. Yeah, and then to say, just like last time, I wouldn't have done anything if I had known. If he had known Sarah was Abraham's wife, he wouldn't have started that encounter the way he did. If he would have known that his subjects took Abraham's well, he would have done something about it already, and it would have been returned to Abraham with no questions asked, is sort of the implication here. And so maybe he's even just trying to extend that trust to Abraham. You need to be willing to trust me. And so this then is that ongoing unfolding the lessons for Abraham, right? Throughout the whole time with the covenant, he has to learn to trust God. He has to learn to trust and have that faith. And that's ultimately what's going to lead us to then that moment on Mount Moriah with Isaac.
Yeah.
Is it really going to...
Yeah, that's definitely where this is headed. And I think as we think about toward the end of the text, like how we get to Mount Moriah after this, I think is a key thing. Thinking about Abimelech, and I know he's certainly a minor character in the scriptures, but he plays an important role here.
Yeah.
Twice, I don't know, just to think about him for a second. So I think in both texts, his protests come off as true.
Yeah.
He didn't know that Sarah was Abraham's wife. He didn't know what was going on with the well here. And yet, at the same time, he's supposed to be a king. And maybe, especially, and I think it comes true more in this one, like he maybe, I don't know, this is a little bit of speculation, or it is speculation on my part, but he doesn't strike me as, he's a little bit distant from some things that he should be paying closer attention to, I think.
I think maybe, I don't know, or is it too much for us to expect him to know all of the little things that are happening in his kingdom? Maybe it means it depends on how big it is. It depends on how intricately he's involved in the lives of his citizens. But I don't know. Yeah, there's definitely some things he doesn't know. But yeah, no, I think maybe more so it's helping us see that Abimelech is going to be a man of integrity. And we need to trust that. We need to be willing to act the way we need to, regardless of what is going to happen in the world. And that, I think, would tie into that identity with the covenant a little bit. But I don't know.
Yeah. No, I think those are helpful comments. Again, that's just me sort of thinking about what we've learned about Abimelech thus far and who he is. I do, and I don't know if you have any thoughts on this. He spoke to the Lord in the previous chapter, and I think the Lord. I don't know that he was actually ever called the Lord in chapter 20. I believe he was consistently referred to as God. But here we have Abimelech, interacting with Abraham in a positive way. Mm-hmm. I don't know if you have any thoughts on if that says anything at all about what his faith is or isn't. I'm not sure that we can say much.
Yeah, I thought about that very early on when I started looking at this, because he's had that dream, right? It says God spoke to him in a dream in that first encounter. And so now he's seeking this covenant official, relationship with Abraham. Is this an expression of faith? And I don't know that we can jump all the way there to saving faith for sure, but at least understanding something special about Abraham. I kind of think of, like Nebuchadnezzar and things in the book of Daniel, and how, or even Cyrus, right, for that matter. These guys are at times positive towards God's people and are making wonderful claims about who God is, but we don't get the sense that their faith is changed. So I don't know. In any regard, he understands something special about Abraham, and he has certainly had divine protection. But does that mean he is going to tell the subjects of Gerar to worship Yahweh? We don't see that. And I think that, as you brought up, he's not called Lord. That was the thing. That was going to be my indicator too. Abimelech says, swear by God, not swear by Yahweh or swear by the Lord. And so that was sort of my indication to think this was more of a, should we call it a diplomatic faith, like that we saw in the book of Daniel.
Yeah, and I think that's a fair read. And this I think this is an important thing to consider, even if we can't say for certain one way or another about what his faith is.
Yeah,
I don't know that we see saving faith, but the reality that God keeps his promise to bless those who bless Abraham, even when the one blessing Abraham is perhaps simply just your average pagan, right, he still receives that blessing, shows you the generosity and grace of God, who, causes the sun to shine on the righteous and the unrighteous. I think that this text serves as an example of that, regardless of which way you go with Abimelech.
Absolutely. I think that's the biggest takeaway and application of this whole text is about God blessing the whole world through his covenant, through his promise. And yes, the same verse popped in my head. He lets it rain on the just and the unjust. Yes. Yeah, I think that's exactly what we see happening here.
Yeah. So Abimelech, he doesn't know what's going on. Honestly, so Abraham then takes the sheep and the oxen. This is, I suppose, I think this might be another slight similarity between what happened before that you have in Genesis chapter 20. Yeah, but it's exactly the other direction. So talk about that. In the other one, Abimelech gave money to prove his innocence. Here, Abraham is giving possessions.
Right. Yeah. So in the previous encounter, just to make everything right, Abimelech gives these gifts to Abraham and Sarah, and to prove his innocence and just to say, make sure there's no bad blood between them. And again, I think that speaks volumes about his integrity, regardless of his faith. And then here we have it going the other way. And I think it's whether it is just or simply and merely the formality of the covenant. I think that's maybe the livestock in general that it talks about. But then when it talks about these 7 ewes, I think it is Abraham showing the legitimacy of his claim. This is a good faith claim. This is not him trying to make up anything or make more trouble. He's legitimately, he's legitimately saying, this was my well. I didn't make this up. I'm not trying to take advantage of you. I'm not trying to take advantage of your graciousness. This is the reality. And so, it's a little bit of that restoration of what we saw previously as the two are bringing their lives into a political harmony, if you will.
All right, so let's talk more about the 7 ewe lambs particularly and how that relates to the name of the place Beersheba.
Sure. So it's a play on words in the Hebrew. The words for oath and 7 have the same root. It's Sheba and Sheba. It's basically the vowel is different or excluded in the root word for how it's applied. I cannot think of any English way to make this make sense to us. It's just using 2 words that sound very, very similar. And so it's very poetic. It's a nice rhetorical aesthetic to the text, and it makes the whole thing sound more beautiful, maybe more important. It's kind of like how we'll use maybe King James style English if we want something to sound really important or to stand out. We see that here with the oath, 7 and oath. It's a place, and it's what ultimately gives the place its name. This rhetorical button is where Beersheba comes from. It can mean either well of the oath or well of the 7. I found an interesting commentary. It was, I think it's H.C. Ryle, who did the Cambridge Press commentary on this section of Genesis. And he says, it could even mean 7 wells. And then he talks about, the archaeological digs have uncovered at least 7 wells at Beersheba, and you can go see them today. I could not find any verification for that. So just a fantastic claim, which is interesting. But we do know there have been significant excavations at the site that is Beersheba, and it uncovers at least 9 levels of continuous occupation that date back to the Iron Age. That's roughly the time of the Judges or the conquest. And that's where we would have the bigger settlements. So it makes sense. We can't, get all the way down to be, this is Abraham's period. No, because there's not enough there to that. But we do know that the place has been important and been in use since this time. And there is still today a well there named Abraham's Well, but because, again, it was so long ago and the site was likely little more than a rest outpost or a watering hole during the time of Abraham, we can't verify its authenticity that this is the well. But this little grammatical, rhetorical feature in the text is where Beersheba gets its name, Well of Oath or Well of Seven, because oath and seven have the same root word. And again, just a little a aesthetic feature of the text that if we're not really digging into the Hebrew, we don't see the significance of. But I think that's why they repeat seven and oath so many times here to really strike it home. This is a big deal. This is God working into the nations.
Yeah, and as I mentioned to you before we started, that the commentary that I consulted noted another commentator that apparently the name Abraham comes up 7 times within this text, and the name Abimelech comes up 7 times within this text. Perhaps a poetic device on Moses' part as he writes this down to emphasize that 7 again. I wish, well of swearing and well of 7, I guess at least start with the same letter. That's about as close as I can get to in the English language.
That was the same thing I came up with. Some people try to say, they sevened themselves, or he sevened himself. I'm like, that's just silly.
You're making stuff up. Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah. So, but to see that is important. And again, this becomes a significant place going forward in the Old Testament. We did hear previously about, Hagar going into the wilderness of Beersheba. So we have encountered the name already. And here we know why it's named that. And again, this becomes an important marker for the promised land, this Beersheba, the southern boundary of the promised land that belongs to Israel. So just keep your ears open for that word, for that place name as you keep reading the Old Testament. So verse 32, they made that covenant at Beersheba, and then Abimelech and Phicol go back to the land of the Philistines. So take us into verse 32.
Yeah, so kind of shifting gears, right? This is sort of the end of the text. They're reiterating that the covenant relationship between Abraham and Abimelech has been established. The diplomatic conference has concluded with everybody being satisfied, and they're all kind of going their own way. Here's where we get that specifically, that reference to the land of the Philistines again, which, again, there's lots of discussion about this reference to the Philistines because our historical understanding is that the Philistines, or the sea peoples, did not infiltrate the area of Canaan for several centuries after the patristic period. Some suggest that this makes it an anachronism or a textual error. I think, as you kind of suggested, it could just be a textual stamp for people, a contextual stamp for those that would know who those people are later on. But we don't know for sure. It could also just be, I think, a bigger picture of history, a little look into what was going on. If we look at those names again, right? Abimelech and Abraham are both Semitic names, but Phicol is that Aegean name. And so perhaps Abimelech is a Semitic ruler. He's a native to the area, but some of his subjects have been immigrants or people that have come over. It's kind of like they would have been an early contingent before the main, I don't want to call them a horde, but the bigger group of Philistines comes over and establishes themselves a few generations later. To me, it reminds me of how we know that there were Scandinavian representatives or Norseman representatives that started exploring North America hundreds of years before the Europeans ever arrived. And so it's that sort of a thing. It could just be, there were people that were already moving over there, and for whatever reason, some of them ended up in the area of Gerar, and they are subjects of Abimelech here. And so this is that representation. It could just be a nice little record in history that otherwise would be lost if it was not for the text being preserved the way it is.
Now, for Abraham's part, he plants a tamarisk tree
Yeah.
in Beersheba. Do you have tamarisk trees in North Dakota?
Not that I'm aware of, but I did look it up. I'm not a huge botanist, but or arborealist, but yeah. So I looked it up. It's also known as the salt cedar. It's a hardy, resilient scrub brush type of tree. They grow in that part of the world, and because of that, they're considered a symbol of hope and resolve in unpromising places. I saw a couple pictures where they can get like beautiful pink blossoms, even in this arid area. But regardless, because of its symbolism for that resolve and that hope, it seems a fitting memorial for the covenant made at Beersheba. God's people are to be faithful and steadfast even with the outside world, and there is the promise of honor and mutual blessing even in a harsh, sin-broken world. Just sort of a fitting memorial. It's not the same as building an altar, right? There wasn't like a divine intervention that happened here, but it's still sort of a note of God's blessing, especially with the other nations. And so something should be done. And so Abraham plants this tree, and then he makes a reference to Yahweh and gives a title that I don't know if we've seen before this point, but it's an interesting one, the Yahweh everlasting God.
Well, let me just on the tree
Sure.
real quick. Yeah, I think it's not quite the same as building an altar. We've seen Abraham do that a couple of times. We have seen him, under the oaks of Mamre before, so he's been around
Right.
trees, obviously. And I think the planting of a tree, maybe it's not perhaps similar to other times when Israel is told sometimes, or they do set up a monument for a variety of reasons. We'll get, and again, it's not quite the same thing because, like you said, there's not particular divine intervention here.
Right.
But going forward, you're going to have the name Bethel, and there's going to be that stone that gets set up.
Yep.
So it's to have some sort of marker for a place is not unusual in the Old Testament. And I
Correct.
think a tree is a fitting one here.
Yeah.
And the idea of this is an ongoing covenant between these two men, between their
Right.
posterity, and a growing tree is
Yes.
going to serve as a reminder of that.
Absolutely. It's a beautiful symbol of that. Then.
Yeah. So, and I think then that maybe ties in somewhat to the name that Abraham gives to the Lord here. He calls him, again, Yahweh, the Lord, and then he's called the everlasting God, which I believe you're right. This is the first time we've heard this used. What's Abraham confessing about Yahweh here?
Yeah. So again, I think because of what it is, it's a nice tie into this lasting promise. It's the Hebrew is El Olam, so God of perpetuity or to perpetuity. I always liked that word in Hebrew class when we saw Olam. It's just a fun one to say. And I like that idea of perpetuity versus forever. Forever seems nebulous. Perpetuity sounds like it's working, right? It doesn't wear out. It keeps going. It doesn't stop working. And so that's a beautiful tie to God's word, right? His word endures forever. And if this is an extension of God's covenant promise, then that's what is happening here. It's ongoing forever. I think it's also a beautiful tie to the title Lord, Yahweh, right? Because Yahweh is that imperfect tense in the Hebrew, which means it is uncompleted. It's a continuing action. He will continue to be I am, and he will always be I am to perpetuity, in perpetuity. I just love that. Similar titles might be Elyon, which is, God Most High, or El Shaddai, God Almighty, but this El Olam, God forever, God everlasting. He keeps going. His word, his covenant keeps going. It's connected to that. He lasts forever, and so does his promise. Through Abraham and Yahweh's covenant with him, all people of the earth are going to be blessed, and this promise is going to last forever.
Yeah. Well, and with that, especially then, so the text ends, verse 34. Abraham sojourned many days in the land of Philistines. And you're thinking, oh, Abraham's got it all. I mean, he's an old man. He's got the promised kid. He's got this treaty with Abimelech. What could possibly go wrong? Well, here comes chapter 22. And God bless you, Pastor Jones, for taking the transitional text. I mean, chapter 22 stands out as a big. I mean, it's literally on a mountain. It's a huge text of the book of Genesis. But I think, especially with that, what you said there about, the everlasting God, that God's promise lasts forever. Abraham makes that confession right before, at least again, as it's recorded. How much time passes isn't said, but as it's recorded, right before he's said, the Lord is the everlasting God.
Right.
And if you think about, also, you compare and contrast this with the previous interaction he had with Abimelech, kind of blew it in chapter 20 with Abimelech. Here he gets it right. And I think as we've seen all along with Abraham, his faith grows. Even as he stumbles in various ways along the way, this sets the stage for what happens in chapter 22 for Abraham's faith, as the writer of Hebrews will tell us, in the resurrection of the dead. He's already got that faith in chapter 21. He puts it into practice in chapter 22. And so as much as like, well, goodness, what's this text doing here? I think you see a number of ways that this sets the stage for what happens in chapter 22. And that name that he gives to the Lord there at the end is key among them in my mind. We got about 2 or 3 minutes here to wrap things up on our text today.
Yeah, so again, I think all of this has been pushing us to that promise, that covenant that God made with Abraham, and it's that extension of it. It's not just about offspring. It's not just about a nation. It's about what God is going to do for the whole world through his promise, through his word. It continues to show that God cares for his people, even in the midst of unbelief, even in the midst of lands that are not their own. Even the secular authorities can see that God blesses his people. Abimelech sees it in Abraham, and so either to avoid misfortune or to show integrity, he's going to seek to have a positive relationship with Abraham. And the same should be true for us. We should be able to live our lives in such a way that people see God working in us, and they should want us as citizens. They should want us as neighbors. That love, that grace, that mercy should flow out of us. That's what the covenant is about. Yes, it's more than promised land. It's more than an enduring line of offspring. The covenant was about redemption and blessing for all people. God saves his people, and others get to benefit from it. His love radiates out through his people into all the earth. Now, obviously, the center of the covenant is going to be Christ. It is Jesus always. He is the promised Messiah. He is the one that overturns the power of sin, and that is how all nations will be ultimately blessed through the offspring of Abraham. But that the cross, the resurrection, are the fulfillment of that chesed, that steadfast love that even Abimelech is able to reference here. It's for all the world. As that merciful love is brought into our lives, we are saved, we are redeemed, and then it is that perpetual promise of God, God everlasting, as our lives resonate with it, that reflects his love to others. And God will fulfill his covenant. His people now demonstrate it for the world. Through the covenant, all nations will be blessed. We see this at Abraham. We obviously see it in Christ as he dies for the whole world. But now we get to see it in the lives of God's people as we continue to bless others with the perpetual mercy and love of God. I'm reminded of Jesus' words in the Sermon on the Mount. In the same way, let your light shine before others, so that they may see your good works and give glory to your Father who is in heaven. That's what we get to see and how we get to apply this text in our lives, I think.
Pastor Rick Jones is chaplain and vice president of spiritual life at the Dakota Boys and Girls Ranch in Minot, North Dakota. He's been helping us today to study Genesis chapter 21, verses 22 to 34. Pastor Jones, thanks for being our guest today.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me. It's always a blessing to be a part of the program.
I am your host here on Sharper Iron, Pastor Timothy Appel of Faith Lutheran Church in Godfrey, Illinois. If you have any questions about Genesis 21, send an email to kfuo@kfuo.org. It is always a joy to hear from you. Join us again tomorrow as we keep reading in Genesis. We will be in chapter 22 when the Lord tests Abraham, asking him to sacrifice his son, his only son whom he loves, Isaac, and the Lord will provide the sacrifice, as we will see. Thanks for spending the morning with us today. Talk with you again tomorrow.
Showing support for KFUO is now easier than ever. You can sport a KFUO shirt, swag, or even socks by visiting our online store. Go to kfuo.org/store and order high-quality KFUO branded merch. You no longer need to wait for our annual share-a-thon for a chance to show your KFUO spirit. Visually share and wear this ministry out in the world by checking out our selection. Every purchase helps to support our proclamation of Christ for you, anytime, anywhere. Go to kfuo.org/store.